Have you ever wondered why others don't seem to want to make a change, even when there's so many positive reasons to do so? If so, you aren't alone. And that's what I want to talk about some today. Why don't others change, even when there's so many reasons that could potentially move us in that direction? Let's dive into that today. And I'm going to be particularly talking about it from the viewpoint of those of us on the vegan or plant-based journey. When we have some sort of awakening that moves us to a vegan lifestyle, we may expect others to be moved in the same way. And so you might think about what led to your vegan journey. Maybe it was something you watched or heard in a program or something you read or just an insight that suddenly hit you. And whether it was for ethical reasons, when you really realize the suffering of sentient beings in animal agriculture and other industries, or when you found out that you could reverse a health condition through a plant-based diet, or you learned about the huge impact of animal agriculture on the environment, on our land use, water use, pollution, deforestation, the climate. Whatever it was that moved you in that direction, it led to a big enough interchange that you were willing to learn the how of a plant-based or vegan lifestyle in a world that doesn't yet fully embrace that or reflect that. But you were willing to learn what you needed to learn to make those changes. And then when you discover this, you want to share it with others and think, well, maybe if they learn about it, they'll want to change too. And yet the reality is sometimes what we instead experience as we share our reasons for going on this vegan path or what we've learned or discovered, we might instead receive defensiveness, judgment, pushback, criticism, or other reactions. And I think sometimes that's the hardest thing for us on our vegan journey, whether we're hoping a loved one will change for health reasons, or we want others to realize the detrimental effects of our food choices, on our own health, on animals and the planet. Sometimes it just really throws us off or can be very disheartening to receive those kinds of responses. And so what I want to talk about today is, well, what is going on here? Why is it that people that we care about and people we know who are compassionate and rational and maybe some of them maybe science-based, why are they not open to considering this change? And so I'm going to bring in a few different factors that can play into this. It won't be a deep dive into any one of these, but an overview that gives a sense of what all is at stake in this particular lifestyle change and what might be influencing others not being open to the change. So let's just dive in. First, I'd like to talk about the psychology of change. As a psychologist who for many years worked as a psychotherapist with people, I found that the stages of change model, which is also called the trans-theoretical model of change, is a super helpful way for us to understand people's internal process, their psychological process of change. And you can first relate it to yourself. Think about your own journey into a vegan or plant-based lifestyle. Think about what motivated you, and think also about what was going on before you even considered it. There's a process, and sometimes we think that change is overnight, and maybe some of you may have had that overnight change yourself. But for most people, actually, change is more gradual. For the majority of people, it's a process that unfolds over time. And so what we don't realize is that sometimes people who we might be wanting to influence to change are actually what's called the pre-contemplation stage, which is basically, as it sounds, it's before contemplating. At this stage, this is the person who's not right now open to change or thinking about change or receptive to changing their diet or their lifestyle. And this could hold true for any kind of lifestyle change, someone that smokes who isn't ready to quit smoking. But in this case, we'll think about it with the vegan or plant-based lifestyle. This is someone who hasn't considered it, or if they have, they felt like the burdens of change outweigh the benefits. And so at this stage, generally, they may not be too open, but there can be windows of opportunity when something happens that may catch their interest or inspire them or motivate them. And so you can be on alert for those moments when, whether it be a health scare or something that intrigues them, where you can maybe plant some seeds. Contemplation is when we're starting to really think about change and are a little more interested, but still ambivalent. And this stage, sometimes learning more about the benefits or really learning how we can make the change doable, that can sometimes move the person or yourself, if you're the one on the journey, into preparation, where you're actually preparing actively for change and setting up your environment, and maybe getting together your resources, your recipes, whatever. And that then moves into action, where we're actually living a vegan lifestyle. But in the early stages of this vegan lifestyle, we might be at risk for setbacks. So we really need support and resources in this action stage. Maintenance is about when we're really learning how to make it part of our life and how to build the habits and the structures that make it just part of our daily routine. And then termination is basically when someone has lived the lifestyle long enough that it's just become such an ingrained part of who they are that it's hard to imagine ever doing anything differently. But as you can see, that's a process, and not everybody is at the same stage in the process. And we have to learn ways to adjust how we're relating to the person, but depending on where they are. And I'd love to talk more about this probably in another talk where I could just focus exclusively on this and how we can support people in the different stages. But today I just wanted to at least introduce the idea to you. And then there are interpersonal dynamics. So I just talked about more the inner psychology of change. Now let's talk about like how our relationships can affect the change process. I think one thing to just remember is our loved ones and family can sometimes be the hardest ones to try to have an influence on when it comes to lifestyle change. I interviewed people for my book, The Vegan Transformation, about their transition and thriving on a plant-based vegan lifestyle. And, some of them shared with me that they were able to influence their loved ones to go vegan or plant-based along with them. But I would say that was not the majority. I think many of those that I interviewed had family members who were not vegan or plant-based. And sometimes when they would try to convince a loved one to consider veganism or plant-based eating, there'd be this resistance that would come up. And sometimes it was a playing out of other conflicts that already existed in the relationship that would get activated. For example, one woman, she really wanted to convince her adult child to, consider going vegan. But every time that V word came up, it just led to conflict and resistance and probably pushing her adult child even further away from considering it. So I think it's just really important to be aware that these are dynamics that would play out with other issues besides veganism as well. But because we feel so passionately about plant-based or vegan living, it can be a trigger in some relationships rather than having the positive impact we would like to have. And also just kind of realizing that people don't change just because we want them to change. Change is something that they have to be motivated to carry out. And so something has to shift inside of them that makes them have a strong enough why and a strong enough how, knowing how to do it, that they're ready to take that action. And so you can plant seeds and you can share resources, but you can't make the change for them. It has to be something that somehow resonates inside of them. And shaming and judging does not work. It just triggers resistance. Think about when someone does that to you, maybe for other things, like maybe for religious reasons or other behavior or lifestyle choices, and people try to make you feel bad for your choices. It rarely makes us open to change. It sort of shuts us down. And I think also we need to realize the influence of social norms. We are social creatures. And I think as veganism and plant-based living becomes more and more mainstream, people will be more and more open to it. But right now it does take a big commitment to, and a big inner shift sometimes to be ready for that journey. So thinking more in terms of planting seeds and supporting someone and improving our communication skills, and also knowing when in particular relationships we might need to kind of let go and just focus more on the relationship. Then there are the social and societal forces. These are huge, and I think I didn't realize the extent to which they do influence people before I became vegan. But I learned about Dr. Melanie Joy's work and her research looking at Carnism, which is a term she coined, and it's basically this invisible societal belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's there in the kind of permeating our culture in ways that we don't often even think about or realize, because it is so normative to eat animal products. We don't even think about it as a choice, again, until something shifts and helps us sort of see things differently and realize that we have other choices. But it takes some time sometimes to realize that, because that's not the normative messaging right now. And so what the messaging that we receive throughout our lives is what Dr. Melanie Joy calls the three N's of justification. We're taught that it's normal, natural, and necessary. And, you know, again, as something shifts for us and we learn new information, we might start to question that and realize that norms are not always what are healthy or right. There are many things that might seem normative that are not things that we really would agree with from an ethical perspective, or that are the most healthy or best way to live. If we look deeper at animal agriculture, the way it's done now, it's not very natural. And as far as necessary, there's a lot of us plant-based people out there thriving. So it starts to kind of help shake up those beliefs, but just understand that this is what's operating under the surface for many of us. And, you know, so when we are compassionate people and we care about animals and yet we eat them, there can be this underlying cognitive dissonance, whether we're aware of it or not. And so that usually leads to us either changing our values and kind of coming up with justifications. Usually this is not conscious, but we might believe things like, well, animals don't really suffer, or some animals are more worthy of moral consideration. My choices don't really make a difference. We have these different defenses that help to lessen our discomfort with our choice. Or something happens that shifts us and we might change our behaviors to match our values, which might lead us to reduce eating meat or even move towards becoming fully plant-based or vegan. And I do need to mention corporate and industry influences as the final kind of category of factors that might be influencing all this. It just plays such a huge role. If you look at advertising, you watch a TV show and everything is about pharmaceuticals or meat products or fast food. There's just so much power in the messaging that we're getting from these industries that play a role even in what's taught to us in schools and the dietary guidelines we receive, the research that's funded. So just being aware that right now, that I think most of us can realize that the meat and dairy industries have a lot more financial power than, for example, the broccoli industry. So they are controlling more of the messaging. So I want to share 5 takeaways. First of all, meet people where they are and kind of recognize their stage of change. You know, not everybody changes at the same pace or in the same way. So you're wanting to kind of target how you approach that person based on where they're at and their readiness and their openness. Sometimes with people that are just not open, or maybe there's a relationship dynamic going on that they would be resistant, we might not be the one to have the influence for that person. Or we might plant seeds, but it might be somewhere else that the seeds really take root. And sometimes we have to let go, that we only have so much influence. We can ask that person to be a support of our own vegan journey, so at least they can understand why it matters to us. And sometimes that helps bypass some of the defensive reaction and just lets them be a support on our journey, and they can learn more and maybe over time become more receptive themselves. I think learning better communication skills, including listening and asking questions. If we don't understand what someone's concerns are and kind of minimize them, they might, someone that might be open to considering change, we might be shutting it down by not listening, by not being interested in their point of view, their interests, their concerns. And then we want to share the resources that actually relate to their interests. And probably most important is being a positive role model. And again, this is especially with people that we care about in our life, how we show up as a plant-based or vegan person, through the great food we share, through our attitude, through the way we live this lifestyle. We can be planting seeds that over time might have an impact that we don't see in the moment. And I invite you to think about your own vegan journey. What seeds were planted before you made the shift? That can sometimes help you to have greater understanding or empathy for others' journeys, which still might be different than yours, but realizing that a lot of times, even if your change seemed dramatic or sudden, there probably were seeds that were planted that you maybe hadn't even thought about. An example for me was that a few months before I became vegetarian, I had eaten at a conference center that had great plant-based food. And that was actually a big seed planted for me, because I had before not known what someone would eat if they were plant-based or vegan, which I think made me really blocked even trying to think about it or learn more about it. But when I realized that there could be great food that I could really enjoy, I think it opened my receptivity. I wasn't quite ready yet then, because I thought, oh, I just don't have the motivation to cook, or I'm not much of a cook, so how would I eat this way? But I at least thought it could be possible. And then I saw this program that just had a major impact on me, and thinking about where my food came from and how it got to me, that suddenly enough seeds had been planted from probably a lot of other experiences too before that, that finally I was ready to take action and start to learn new ways of eating and cooking, and just dive right into it. And over time, other seeds were planted that led me to become fully vegan. It does help to reflect on that journey that you had, to have more empathy for others' journeys and an understanding of the social, interpersonal, and cultural factors that play a role in all of this. I wanted to share a couple of resources with you. For those of you on the vegan journey, I have a vegan resilience toolkit that helps with just our coping skills for the vegan journey, including some ways that we can improve our communication. I have a vegan resilience intensive group coaching program coming up, and the registration's closing in a couple of days. But I'd love to have you join me if it really resonates for you. You can learn more through the QR code here. And last of all, you can take a screenshot of this. These are some resources that I think are super helpful, different books that touch on the top several books have to do with vegan communication. And then the bottom two are just communication in general that I think are great books. So these are some resources you might want to consider. And just remember, social change happens over time as seeds are planted, and it starts with individuals who start to realize the true benefits of change. And then as more people change towards a plant-based lifestyle, it starts to have a ripple effect where more and more resources are available to people, more food is available for people, it becomes more accessible and doable. And when enough people make a change, it can lead to a tipping point. So hopefully each of us, through the way we live our life and role model this lifestyle, we can be part of that change and creating that tipping point. So just standing with you on your journey, wishing you a great rest of the day, and talk to you more soon.